My daughter spent 10 years telling me our neighbor was a monster who deserved to rot. When he finally died, not a single person in our town shed a tear. I went to the funeral out of politeness, expecting closure. Instead, I looked into the open casket and saw a detail that made my heart stop. The man lying there was not a stranger, and the monster was not him. My name is Elena, and I have lived in this siding-clad box of a house for 22 years. The shingles are curling up like dried leaves, mirroring the slow decay of the rest of the neighborhood. Since my husband Richard passed away 5 years ago, the silence in the hallways has become a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. I spend most of my days brewing coffee that I never finish and staring out the front window at a world that seems to be moving on without me. It is a quiet existence, interrupted only by the obligatory Sunday visits from my daughter, Sarah. Our relationship has been like a frayed rope for a long time, held together by shared genetics and very little else. Sarah drives a silver coupe that she parked aggressively in the driveway, as if the concrete had personally offended her. She came in bringing the cold air and a frantic energy that always made my temples throb. She did not ask how I was. She never does. Instead, she marched straight to the living room window and peered through the blinds, her knuckles white as she gripped the plastic wand. "He's still there," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with a venom I could not understand. "Mum, tell me you kept the doors locked." She was talking about Arthur Vance. He lived in the house directly to our left, to the rest of the street. Arthur was a ghost. He was a man of few words who mowed his lawn at exactly 8 in the morning on Saturdays and took his trash out on Tuesdays. He was tall, gaunt, and had eyes that seemed permanently fixed on the ground. The neighborhood wives whispered about him at the grocery store, trading rumors like currency, but nobody actually knew him. Sarah, however, did not just dislike him. She loathed him with a passion that seemed disproportionate to his quiet existence. "You are being paranoid, Sarah," I said, placing a coaster under her water glass. "The man is 70 years old. He barely walks to the mailbox." "That is exactly what he wants you to think," she snapped, turning to look at me with wide, fearful eyes. "He is dangerous. I've seen the way he looks at this house. I've seen him watching you." I did not argue, but I did not agree either. I simply observed. That is what you do when you are a widow with too much time. You become a watcher. I had seen things that did not quite add up, though I never admitted this to Sarah. I had seen the light in his study burn until 4 in the morning, casting a long yellow rectangle onto my lawn. I had seen a black sedan pull into his driveway once a month, stay for exactly 5 minutes, and leave without the driver ever stepping out. There were envelopes that arrived in thick, brown packaging, devoid of return addresses. In modern America, silence is often mistaken for guilt. We live in an era where everyone is terrified of their neighbors, where a man living alone is automatically assumed to be a predator. I tried to be rational. I told myself that insomnia was common in the elderly and that perhaps he just ordered books online. But the seed of doubt Sarah had planted was taking root, feeding on the isolation of our street. Then came the Tuesday that changed the texture of the air on our block. It was a grey afternoon, the kind where the sky looks like wet concrete. I was washing dishes when the silence was shattered not by a scream, but by the wail of sirens. They cut through the neighborhood, loud and intrusive. I dried my hands on a towel and walked to the front door. opening it just as the ambulance screeched to a halt in front of Arthur Vance's house. 2 paramedics rushed in, but their movements lacked the urgency of a rescue. They were going through the motions. I stood on my porch, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself against the wind. Sarah's words echoed in my mind, warning me of danger, of a threat I could not see. An hour later, they wheeled a gurney out. The sheet was pulled up over the face. Arthur Vance was dead. The neighborhood stood behind their curtains, watching the spectacle with a detachment that chilled me more than the wind. There was no grief in the air, only a morbid curiosity. I watched the ambulance doors close, swallowing the man my daughter hated, and for the first time, I felt a strange prickle of fear. It was not because he was dangerous, but because now, whatever secrets he kept behind those drawn blinds were left unguarded. The days following Arthur Vance's death were suffocated by a bizarre, heavy quiet. You might expect a neighborhood to feel a sudden void when a resident dies, even an unpopular one. But this was different. It felt as though the entire street had collectively exhaled, releasing a breath they had been holding for years. There were no casseroles left on his porch. There were no flowers by his mailbox. The only activity came from the estate agents who circled the property like vultures in cheap suits, already calculating the commission on a house that had been a source of local anxiety for as long as I could remember. My daughter, Sarah, sat at my kitchen table 2 days after the ambulance took him away. She was holding a mug of herbal tea, and for the first time in a decade, the lines of tension around her mouth had smoothed out. It was unsettling. Most people look somber when death touches their proximity, but Sarah looked as if she had just returned from a spa vacation. She took a long sip and set the mug down with a deliberate, satisfied clink. "I know you think I am heartless. Mom," she said, looking me dead in the eye. "But you have no idea what it feels like to finally be safe. It is like the air is cleaner." He was an old man who died alone. "Sarah," I replied, wiping down the counter just to have something to do with my hands. "It feels wrong to celebrate it." "I am not celebrating," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am just grateful. He was a monster. You didn't know him. You didn't see the way he existed." I did not press her. I had learned long ago that pushing Sarah only made her dig her heels in deeper, but her reaction sat in my stomach like a stone. The funeral was held on a rainy Friday morning at a small chapel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that smelled of damp carpet and stale lilies. I went because my mother raised me to believe that paying respects was mandatory, regardless of personal feelings. I expected to see a few curious neighbors, perhaps a distant cousin or two. What I found was a room that was almost entirely empty. There were perhaps 5 other people scattered across the pews, none of whom sat together. They looked like locals who had come to confirm he was actually dead rather than to mourn him. I sat in the 3rd row, clutching my purse. The silence was not peaceful. It was cold. It felt judgmental. The officiant, a young man who clearly had never met Arthur Vance, stumbled through a eulogy that was painful in its vagueness. He spoke of peace and rest, using generic phrases that could have applied to anyone. There was no mention of a career, no mention of hobbies, no mention of family. It was as if Arthur had simply appeared in our neighborhood one day and then ceased to exist. "He lived a quiet life," the officiant said, adjusting his glasses. "And now he returns to the quiet earth." When the service ended, the few attendees shuffled out quickly, avoiding eye contact with one another. I waited until they were gone before I approached the open casket. I felt a need to see him one last time, to reconcile the monster my daughter described with the recluse I had watched from my window. Arthur looked smaller in death. His face was pale and waxy, stripped of the grim expression he wore in life. He looked harmless. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye. His hands were folded over his chest, resting on a cheap black suit that looked 2 sizes too big. Pinned to the lapel of his jacket was a small, tarnished silver brooch. It was shaped like a dove in mid-flight, but one of the wings was chipped. My breath hitched in my throat. It was such a delicate, sentimental object for a man who supposedly radiated danger. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. The metal was worn smooth, suggesting he had touched it often. Why? I whispered to the empty room. Why do you have that? It was a detail that did not fit the narrative. A monster does not wear a chipped silver dove to his grave. A monster does not cherish something so fragile. As I stared at that pin, a cold shiver ran down my spine, not from fear of the dead, but from a sudden, terrifying realization that the living might have been wrong. I walked out of the funeral home into the rain, but the image of that silver dove burned in my mind, planting a seed of doubt that was about to grow into something terrible. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was not just a generic silver dove. I recognized the specific curvature of the beak and the way the left wing was chipped at the very tip. I had held that pin in my hands 30 years ago. It was a tie pin I had given to Richard for our 5th anniversary. He had told me he lost it during a conference in Chicago in 1999. He had come home looking distraught, apologizing profusely. And I had told him it was just a thing, and things could be replaced. But here it was. It was resting on the chest of the man my daughter claimed was a stranger, a predator, a monster who watched us from the shadows. The air in the chapel suddenly felt too thin. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was not a coincidence. Coincidences are finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk, not finding a lost family heirloom on the corpse of a neighbor you were told to fear. If Arthur Vance had this pin, he knew Richard. And if he knew Richard, then Sarah's narrative of a creepy, unknown stalker began to fracture. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I had spent years looking through my blinds with suspicion because I trusted my daughter's fear. I had let her hatred shape my reality. But what if her fear was not about what he might do, but about what he knew? I turned away from the casket, my legs feeling unsteady. The funeral director was standing by the entrance, checking something on a clipboard. He was a balding man with a weary expression. I approached him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me," I said. Did Mr. Vance leave any family contacts? Anyone at all?" The director looked up, blinking as if surprised anyone was still there. "No, ma'am. The arrangements were prepaid years ago. Very specific instructions. No viewing. Closed casket usually. But he requested it be open for exactly 1 hour. Said he wanted to make sure the right people saw him." "The right people?" I asked. The room was empty. "He was a particular man," the director said, lowering his voice. "To be honest, the paperwork was a headache. His death certificate says Arthur Vance, but the prepaid account was under a different name originally. Then it was changed. It happens, but usually not like this." "What was the other name?" I pressed, my fingers gripping the strap of my purse. He hesitated, glancing at his notes. "I shouldn't really say, but it was Wait. It says Arthur C. here, and an old note about a miller, probably just a clerical error from the previous ownership. Miller. The name meant nothing to me, but the secrecy meant everything. I thanked him and walked out into the drizzle. The drive home was a blur. Every time I stopped at a red light, I saw the silver dove. I saw Richard's face when he told me he lost it. I saw Sarah's face when she screamed that Arthur was dangerous. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the empty house next door. It looked different now. It did not look like the lair of a monster. It looked like a vault. I felt a wave of nausea, not from illness, but from guilt. I had blindly accepted the role of the victimized neighbor. I had never once walked over and said hello. I had never asked him his story. I had let Sarah paint the world for me. I unlocked my front door, but I did not take off my coat. I went straight to the garage where Richard's old file cabinets were stored. They had been gathering dust for 5 years, buried under Christmas decorations and gardening tools. I needed to know the truth. If Arthur Vance knew my husband, then he knew me. And if he knew me, then my daughter had been lying to me for a decade. I was done watching from the window. It was time to open the boxes. I pulled the cardboard box labelled 1999 off the metal shelf, ignoring the cloud of grey dust that coated my tongue. I sat on the cold concrete floor and dumped the contents out. The pile was a chaotic mix of faded receipts, tax forms, and old Christmas cards. My hands moved fast, fueled by a panic I had never felt before. Richard had told me he lost the pin in Chicago in mid-July of that year. I needed to prove he was there. I needed the world to make sense again. I found his credit card statement from that month. I ran my finger down the list of transactions. There were no charges in Chicago. There were no airline tickets. Instead, there was a series of charges at a roadside motel in a town called Oakhaven, only 40 miles north of here. You lied to me, I whispered to the damp air of the garage. Richard, why did you lie beneath the statement? I found a check stub. It was written for $5,000, a significant sum for us back then. The payee was Aegis Security Consultants. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling as I typed the name into the search bar. Nothing. No website. No business license. No history. It was a ghost company. A front used to move money without leaving a trail. I dug deeper, my fingernails tearing at the edges of the paper. I found a letter clipped to the back of a life insurance policy. It was handwritten on plain white paper. The signature at the bottom was a jagged scrawl. A. Miller. The handwriting was distinctive, with sharp, angular loops. It was identical to the note I had seen on Arthur Vance's porch once when he left a delivery instruction for the mailman. Arthur Vance was Arthur Miller, and he was on my husband's payroll. He knew him, I said, my voice shaking. He was working for us. The letter was dated August 3rd, 1999. It read, "The situation with the girl is contained. I have moved into the property adjacent as agreed. Surveillance will be 24/7. She does not know who I am, and she must never know. The agency is dissolving the record. The air left my lungs. Sarah had told me Arthur moved in 2 years later. She had told me he was a stranger who started watching her through the fence, a pervert who made her skin crawl. But the letter said he was placed there. He was not a stalker. He was a guard, or a warden. Why did you need a guard? Sarah, I choked out, clutching the paper so hard it crinkled. I thought back to that summer. Sarah was 16. She had told me she was going to a cheerleading camp for 2 weeks. I checked the family calendar Richard had saved in the box. The dates were marked Sarah, camp. But underneath the calendar was a medical bill from an urgent care clinic in Oakhaven. It was dated the same week she was supposed to be at camp. The treatment listed was for lacerations and shock. She had never gone to camp. Richard had taken her to that motel in Oakhaven, and Arthur Vance had been brought in to clean up the mess. My whole history was rewriting itself in the dim light of the garage. Every time Sarah had come to me crying about the neighbor staring at her, she was lying. She knew who he was. She knew why he was watching. Her hatred was not fear of a predator. It was the desperation of someone who wanted the only witness to disappear. I reached for the last document in the file. It was a photocopy of a police report, but the header was stamped sealed. The narrative was blacked out with thick marker, but one name at the bottom was circled in red ink by Richard's hand. It was not Sarah's name. It was not Arthur's. It was a name I had never heard before. But seeing it made my stomach drop. Jessica Thorne. I read aloud. Who was Jessica Thorne? And why did my husband and the man next door destroy their lives to keep her name buried? I looked at the pile of papers, the lies of 20 years staring back at me. Sarah had not been a victim. She had been the center of a cover-up so expensive it had cost Richard his integrity and Arthur Vance his identity. I stood up, the paper trembling in my hand. I had to know who Jessica Thorne was, and I had a sickening feeling that my daughter was the reason nobody else did. I called Sarah and told her to come over immediately. I did not give a reason, but the tone of my voice must have been enough, because she arrived in under 15 minutes. She walked into the kitchen with her car keys still clutched in her hand, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for a trap. I had placed the file from the garage on the table, closed, but its presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "What is wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. "You sounded like someone died. Someone did die." "Sarah," I said, sitting down and resting my hand on the folder. "Arthur died. But I think the truth about him has been dead for a lot longer." "Oh, for God's sake." She groaned, rolling her eyes and turning toward the door. "I am not doing this again. I told you. I am glad he is gone. Can we please just move on?" "Sit down," I commanded. It was a tone I had not used since she was a teenager. And it worked. She froze, then slowly pulled out a chair and sat on the edge of it, ready to bolt. "I went through your father's old papers." I began, watching her face closely. "I found a check. $5,000 paid to a security firm, and a letter signed by Arthur Miller. He didn't move in here 2 years after the incident. Sarah. He was planted here in 1999. By your father." Sarah's face went pale, draining of colour so fast it looked painful. She stared at the folder, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. You have no right to dig through that stuff," she hissed. "Dad's business was private. He wasn't a stranger." "Sarah," I pressed, leaning forward. "He was working for us. The letter said he was here to contain the situation with the girl. He was protecting you. Why have you spent 10 years telling me he was a monster?" "Because he was," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "You don't get it. You were always so oblivious. Dad paid him to be my shadow. Do you know what it's like to have a man watching your every move, checking your mail, tracking where you go? He wasn't protecting me. Mom, he was holding me hostage from what I asked, my voice trembling. From the truth about Oakhaven, I know you didn't go to camp. I found the medical bills. What happened at that motel? Sarah stood up, knocking her chair back against the wall. She looked cornered, her eyes darting around the kitchen. The resentment that had been simmering between us for years was boiling over. But now I saw something else mixed in with the anger. Panic. "I am leaving," she announced, grabbing her purse. "I am not talking about this. Dad handled it. It is done." "Who is Jessica Thorne?" I asked. The name hung in the air like smoke. Sarah stopped halfway to the door. Her shoulders stiffened. She did not turn around. But I could see her hands shaking violently. "I don't know who that is," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Liar," I whispered. "Arthur knew her. Dad knew her. And you know her. Is she the reason Arthur had to live here? Is she the reason you hated him?" Because he knew Sarah spun around. Her face twisted into a snarl that made her look like a stranger. "He didn't just know. Mum, he held it over my head. Every time I tried to live my life, there he was, reminding me that one phone call could ruin everything. He wasn't a guardian. He was a blackmailer waiting for Dad's money to run out. He died in a house filled with cheap furniture and wore a chipped tie pin," I said quietly. "He didn't look like a blackmailer. He looked like a man serving a sentence." "You don't know anything," Sarah screamed, tears finally spilling over. "You sat in this house drinking coffee while Dad and I cleaned up the mess. You think you want the truth? You couldn't handle the truth. Jessica Thorne isn't just some name in a file. She was the mistake. My blood ran cold. She had called a human being a mistake." "What did you do to her?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes widened, realizing she had gone too far. She took a step back, her hand covering her mouth as if to physically shove the words back in. I didn't mean." She stammered. "I have to go." She turned and ran out the door. I heard her car engine roar to life and tires screech against the pavement. I stood alone in the kitchen, the silence rushing back in. But it was different now. I was no longer afraid of the empty house or the dead neighbor. A cold, creeping terror settled into my bones as I realized that the person I should have been afraid of all along had just walked out my front door. My daughter was not hiding from a monster. She was hiding what she had become. The address on the credit card statement led me to the Blue Pine Motel, a crumbling strip of stucco located 40 miles north of my driveway. The neon sign was buzzing with a dead letter, and the parking lot was empty, save for a rusted pickup truck. I parked my car and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was chasing a ghost story into the real world, and I was terrified of what I would find. I walked into the front office. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and pine cleaner. An elderly woman with hair dyed a harsh shade of red was sitting behind the counter, watching a game show on a small television. She looked up at me with suspicious eyes. "We charge by the hour, or by the night," she said, her voice sounding like gravel crunching under tires. "Cash only for the hourly rates." I pulled the photograph of Arthur Vance out of my purse. It was a picture I had taken from his obituary online, grainy and unflattering. But it was all I had. I slid it across the laminate counter. "I am not looking for a room," I said. "I am looking for information. Do you recognize this man? He would have been here in August of 1999. He might have used the name Miller." The woman squinted at the photo, then let out a dry, humorless laugh. She did not need to check a logbook. Her reaction was immediate. "Miller," she said, tapping a long fingernail on the photo. "I haven't seen his face in years, but I remember him. He's the one who paid for the new carpet in room 4. "Carpet?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Yeah," she said, leaning back in her chair. "He came here with 2 girls, teenage girls. One was crying so hard I thought she'd choke. The other one, she was quiet. Scary quiet. Miller. He was a wreck. He wasn't mean, though. That's what I remember. He looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. My daughter told me he was a monster." I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. She said he threatened her. Threatened her. The woman scoffed. "Lady, that man was the only thing standing between that girl and a jail cell. I heard them arguing through the walls. He wasn't threatening to hurt her. He was begging her to understand what she had done. He kept saying, 'I can't let you destroy your life.' He paid me $2,000 to forget I ever saw them. Said he was going to take care of it. Said he was going to make sure nobody ever found out." I felt the room sway. Sarah had described Arthur as a predator who hunted her. But this woman was describing a guardian, a cleaner. "The quiet girl?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What did she look like, blonde?" The woman said instantly, "Pretty face, cold eyes." She looked at Miller like he was the help. She looked at the crying girl like she was trash. Sarah was blonde. I walked out of the office and stood in the drizzle of the parking lot. The pieces were slamming together in my mind, forming a picture I did not want to see. Arthur Vance had not isolated himself because he was a creep. He had isolated himself because he was on a mission. The late-night lights, the solitary existence, the constant watching from the window. It was not stalking. It was surveillance. He was not protecting himself from the neighborhood. He was protecting the neighborhood from my daughter. I thought about the years of tension, the way Sarah would freeze whenever Arthur was in his yard. I had assumed it was fear of abuse. Now I realized it was the fear of a criminal seeing her parole officer. Arthur had known the truth about Jessica Thorne, whoever she was. He had known what Sarah was capable of. "You were protecting us," I whispered to the grey sky. "You weren't the monster. You were the cage. But if Arthur was the cage, then the cage was now broken. He was dead. And whatever impulse he had spent 20 years suppressing in my daughter was now unchecked." I looked at my phone. There was a text message from Sarah. "I am coming over. Mum. We need to finish our talk. For the first time in my life, the notification of a message from my child did not bring me comfort. It made my blood run cold." I got into my car and locked the doors, a useless gesture against the truth that was waiting for me back home. I had to choose between the daughter I raised and the stranger who had died silently next door. And God help me. I was starting to believe the stranger. I raced home, my tires squealing against the asphalt as I turned onto our street. The house sat there in the fading twilight, looking deceptively normal. But as I rushed to the front porch, I saw it. A thick manila envelope was wedged between the storm door and the frame. There was no return address. But the handwriting was unmistakably sharp and angular. It was Arthur's. He must have mailed it days before he died, a failsafe triggered by his own mortality. I ripped the envelope open right there on the porch, my keys jingling in my trembling hand. Inside was not a letter, but a photocopy of an official police log from the Oak Haven precinct, dated August 3rd, 1999. Stapled to it was a handwritten confession signed by Arthur Miller. I read the first paragraph, and the world tilted on its axis. I, Arthur Miller, former cleanup contractor for Aegis Security, testify that on the night of August 3rd, I was hired by Richard Evans to dispose of evidence regarding the death of Jessica Thorne. The subject, Sarah Evans, age 16, did not act in self-defense. The injuries to the victim were sustained while she was unconscious. It was an execution. I gagged, a dry heave that bent me double. The paper shook violently in my hands. I forced myself to read on. Subject S displayed zero empathy during transport. She complained about the blood on her shoes. I advised the father that she was a high-risk sociopath. We agreed on a containment protocol. I would move next door. I would become the permanent surveillance. If she stepped out of line again, I would release the evidence. She hates me because I am the only one who knows what she really is. I am not her stalker. I am her warden. The realization crashed into me with the force of a freight train. My daughter was not a victim of trauma. She was a killer. And Arthur Vance, the man I had allowed myself to fear, the man I had ignored for 2 decades, had spent the last 20 years of his life in a self-imposed prison just to make sure my daughter did not hurt anyone else. I thought about every time Sarah had cried about him watching her. She was not afraid of being attacked. She was furious that she was being watched. She wanted him gone so she could be free of the only witness to her crime. And I had taken her side. I had comforted the murderer and shunned the guardian. Oh, God. What have we done? I whispered, clutching the doorframe for support. I looked at the driveway. Sarah's silver coupe turned the corner at the end of the block. The headlights swept across the lawn, illuminating the empty house where Arthur had lived his lonely, vigilant life. I felt a surge of nausea followed by a cold, hard rage. I had been a pawn. My husband had bought silence with money, and I had bought it with ignorance. We had raised a monster and then paid a stranger to keep it in a cage next door. The car pulled into the driveway, the engine cutting out. I shoved the papers inside my coat, pressing them against my chest like a shield. The door opened, and Sarah stepped out. She looked impeccable, her hair perfectly styled, her face composed. She looked like the innocent daughter I thought I knew. But now, all I could see was the coldness in her eyes that the motel owner had described. "Mom," Sarah called out, walking toward the porch with a brisk, annoyed pace. "Why are you standing out here in the dark? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I haven't seen a ghost," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. "I have just been reading what she asked," stopping at the bottom of the steps. Her eyes flicked to the envelope in my hand, and for a split second, the mask slipped. I saw the calculation. I saw the threat. Just old mail. I lied, gripping the cold metal of the door handle. "Come inside." "Sarah, we have a lot to talk about." She hesitated, her gaze narrowing. "You are acting weird." "Mom, you are shaking." "Are you okay?" "I am fine," I said, opening the door and stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. "I just want to hear the truth. From you." Sarah walked up the steps, the sound of her heels clicking on the concrete echoing like gunshots in the quiet night. She stepped across the threshold, into the house where she had grown up, the house where she had learned how to hide who she was. I closed the door behind her and locked it. The click of the deadbolt was loud and final. I was not locked in with my daughter anymore. I was locked in with Jessica Thorne's killer. And for the first time in 20 years, the warden was gone. I placed the manila envelope on the kitchen island. The sound of the paper hitting the granite was soft, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a gavel striking a block. Sarah stared at it, her eyes tracking the jagged handwriting of the man she had called a monster for 20 years. She did not reach for it. She did not need to. She knew exactly what was inside. "Jessica Thorne," I said, my voice barely steady. Arthur confessed. "Sarah." He wrote everything down. He told me what you did to her. Sarah looked up at me. There were no tears. There was no panic. Her face settled into a mask of cold, bored irritation. The same look she used to give me when I asked her to clean her room as a teenager. "Arthur was a rat," she said, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. "I told Dad he was a liability. I told him you can't trust a man who has nothing to lose." "He wasn't a rat," I shouted, the anger finally breaking through my shock. "He was your jailer. He lived in that house, alone and miserable, just to make sure you didn't hurt anyone else." "Why? Sarah, why did you kill that girl?" Sarah walked over to the refrigerator and opened it, pulling out a bottle of water as if we were discussing the weather. She twisted the cap off with a sharp crack. She was going to tell everyone. She was going to ruin me. "Ruin you?" I asked, stepping closer, my hands shaking. "Over what? A boy? A grade? What could possibly justify beating a girl to death?" Sarah took a sip of water and looked at me with eyes that were terrifyingly empty. She found my stash. "Mum, the pills." She was going to tell the coach. I would have been kicked off the squad. I would have lost my scholarship. I wasn't going to let some jealous little nobody take my future away. I did what I had to do. I felt the blood drain from my face. She had taken a human life over a cheerleading spot. She had bludgeoned a girl to death to protect a scholarship she never even used. "And Arthur?" I asked. A new, sickening suspicion taking root in my gut. "You told me he was dangerous. You made me fear him. Why?" "Because he was dangerous," Sarah snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. "Do you have any idea what it is like to live with a gun to your head every time I got a promotion? Every time I started dating someone? He was there, watching, reminding me that he owned me. He told me if I ever slipped up, if I ever showed violent tendencies again, he would send that envelope to the police. He wasn't protecting the neighborhood. Mom, he was torturing me. He was keeping you in check." I screamed. "He gave up his life to clean up your mess because your father paid him to, and now he is dead." I looked at her, really looked at her, the relief she had shown at his funeral, the comment about the air being cleaner. "He didn't just die, did he?" I whispered. Sarah smiled, a small, chilling curve of her lips. "He was old. Mom, his heart was weak. Maybe someone just switched his medication with sugar pills. Maybe he just needed a little push to finally leave me alone." The room spun. She hadn't just killed Jessica Thorne. She had murdered Arthur Vance, the man I had ignored, the man who had lived in the shadows to protect the world from my daughter, had been silenced by the very person he was guarding. "You are a monster," I breathed out, stepping back until my hip hit the counter. "I am a survivor," Sarah corrected, her voice hardening into steel. "And now you have a choice. You can take that envelope and destroy this family. You can send your only child to prison and die alone in this rotting house. Or you can burn it. You can be my mother. You can do what Dad did and protect me." She took a step toward me, her hand reaching out, not in supplication, but in a demand for loyalty. I looked at the envelope, then at my daughter's outstretched hand. I realized then that the grief I had felt at the funeral wasn't for a neighbor I didn't know. It was for the daughter I never really had. I was standing in the kitchen with a killer who wore my child's face, and she was waiting to see if I was as corrupt as her father. I did not take her hand. I looked at it, hovering in the space between us, manicured and steady. And all I could see were the hands of a 16-year-old girl washing blood off her shoes in a motel sink. The silence in the kitchen was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the air feel thick and stale. I stepped back, wrapping my arms around my waist, as if trying to hold my shattering world together. "You look at me like I am a stranger," Sarah said, her voice wavering slightly for the first time. "Mom, please, stop looking at me like that. I am your daughter. I don't know who you are," I whispered, the words scraping against my throat. I thought I raised a daughter, Sarah, but I raised a... I don't even have a word for it. You killed a girl. You killed our neighbor. And you are standing here drinking water like it is just another Tuesday. "It is survival," Sarah hissed, slamming the water bottle down. "You think Dad was a saint. He knew he paid for it. He knew that sometimes you have to cut out the rot to save the rest of the fruit. I am the only one left who is willing to do what is necessary to keep this family standing. The family is already dead." "Sarah," I said, my voice hollow. "It died in 1999. We have just been living in the corpse." I turned away from her and walked to the window, the same window where I had spent years judging Arthur Vance. The view was the same, the peeling paint of his porch, the overgrown hydrangeas, the dark windows, but the meaning had entirely inverted. For 2 decades, I had looked at that house and seen a threat. Now, I saw a prison cell. I saw a man who had accepted a life of solitary confinement to contain a danger he could not legally destroy. I felt a wave of shame so potent it nearly brought me to my knees. Arthur had not been the villain of my story. He had been the tragic hero, and I had been the oblivious villain, enabling the true monster to thrive. He was protecting me from you, I said to the reflection in the glass. He was a leech. Sarah spat out behind me. He bled Dad dry for years, and then he tried to control me. You didn't have to listen to his voicemails. You didn't have to read his letters. I am watching you, Sarah. Don't go there, Sarah. He suffocated me. He was trying to save your soul, I replied quietly, turning back to face her. And he failed. Sarah's face hardened. She picked up her purse, realizing that her appeal to my maternal instinct was hitting a wall of cold reality. She adjusted her coat, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles, regaining that terrifying composure that had fooled everyone for half her life. You are upset, she said, her tone dismissive and cold. You are in shock. I get it. I will go. I will give you the night to think about it. But remember this, Mom. If I go down, I take the memory of Dad with me. I take this house. I take your reputation. You will be the mother of a murderer. You will be the widow of a criminal. Is that how you want to end your life alone and disgraced? She waited for me to answer, to beg her to stay, to promise her that we would burn the envelope together. But I said nothing. I just stared at her. The silence stretched out, filling the room, louder than any scream. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a bridge burning, the crackling sound of love turning into ash. "Fine," she snapped. "Be stubborn. I will call you in the morning. Don't do anything stupid." She walked to the door, her heels clicking with that same rhythmic arrogance. I listened to the sound of the front door opening and closing. I listened to her car start. I listened to her drive away, leaving me alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. I looked down at the manila envelope on the counter. It was heavy, heavier than paper should be. It held the weight of 2 lives, Jessica Thorne and Arthur Vance. I felt a deep, aching emptiness in my chest, a void where my motherly love used to be. I was not going to sleep tonight. I was not going to cry. I had spent 20 years blind, and now that my eyes were finally open, I had one last thing I had to do for the man next door. The neighbor I never knew was about to get the justice he died for. I did not wait for the sun to rise. I drove to the county precinct at 4 a.m, the streets empty and slick with dew. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat like a passenger, silent and heavy. Sarah had gambled on my fear of shame. She thought the threat of scandal would silence me just as it had silenced her father. But she had forgotten that I had already lost my husband to secrets, and I was not willing to lose my soul to them as well. I walked into the station and placed the envelope on the desk of the night sergeant. "I need to report a homicide," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. "Actually, I need to report 2. The unravelling was swift and brutal. By noon, the police had swarmed Sarah's apartment. I was not there to see it, but the detective told me later that she did not cry. She did not scream. She simply asked for her lawyer and looked at the officers with the same cold, bored detachment she had shown in my kitchen. When they led her away, she didn't look back. She had cut me out of her life the moment she realized I was no longer useful to her survival. The truth about Arthur Vance broke the local news cycle within 48 hours. The headline was not about a creepy recluse dying alone. It read, "Silent guardian neighbor hid evidence to protect community." The town that had shunned him, the neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid him, were suddenly filled with performative regret. Flowers piled up on his porch, obscuring the peeling paint. I watched them from my window, the irony tasting bitter on my tongue. They were mourning a hero they had treated like a villain. I went to his funeral site a week later. It was just a fresh mound of dirt with a temporary marker. I placed a single white rose on the earth. "I am sorry," I whispered to the ground. "I am sorry I listened to the lie. I am sorry I left you in that cage alone. I lost everything, just as Sarah had predicted. The friends I had in the neighborhood stopped calling, unsure of what to say to the mother of a double murderer. My husband's legacy was tarnished. His business dissolved in posthumous lawsuits. I was the widow of a man who covered up a killing and the mother of the monster who committed it. I walked through the grocery store and felt the weight of staring eyes. But for the first time in 20 years, I did not feel the weight of a lie. The house is quiet now. It is a true silence, not the pregnant, fearful silence of before. I sold the big family table. I packed away the photos of Sarah. I kept only one thing. On my nightstand sits the chipped silver dove pin. I reclaimed it from the funeral home before they buried him. Some nights, I sit by the window and look at the empty house next door. The lights are off. The curtains are open. There is no one watching me anymore. I am finally free. But freedom has a terrible cost. I saved my conscience. But I had to bury my family to do it. I touch the sharp wing of the silver dove and wonder if Arthur found peace in the end, or if he, like me, simply found that the only way to be clean is to be alone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So please drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what you would have done in the mother's position. Don't forget to subscribe to Nora Revenge Stories, like this video, and smash that hype button so we can share more stories like this with the world.